Welcome back, Amazing Race fans. This is episode number 5 of Jason's Amazing Race Recap 37. And today I'll review episode 5 of season 37 of The Amazing Race. The first thing I'll say about this episode is, wow, there is a lot to talk about in this episode, so let's get started. I'm your host, Jason Mogul. So far this season, we've had the fork in the road, the intersection, the express pass, and then the driver's seat. And on this episode, episode number 5, we had the live double U-turn vote. The specific order of these in the season was not random. My observation is that, in the order that they have been revealed on the show, the strategic importance of the racers' decisions at each one of these events has increased over the previous one. For example, there wasn't much strategy to consider at the fork in the road. It was a decision. Do you want to dance or do you want to sing? That's about it. Then came the intersection, and it had a little more strategy to consider, and then even more regarding acquisition and use of the express pass, and yet even more for Jonathan and Anna to consider at the driver's seat. It seems to me, after thinking about it, the producers knew this when they designed the race, and that the order the racers faced these challenges was well thought out. And, as racers faced each one of these events, the possible implications to how the race will end has gone up too, until they reach the live vote double U-turn. That was the most significant event so far in the race, in my opinion, and I'll talk more about that later. But let's back up for a minute. 9 teams remained after the elimination of Bernie and Kerrigan on leg 4 in Indonesia. Bernie and Kerrigan. Aren't those the coolest names for friends on an Amazing Race team? But you know, have you noticed that this season teams don't have team names like they used to in the past? Like the Cowboys or the Gutsy Grannies. Remember them? Or the Bowling Moms or even the Afghanimals. If teams have names this season, I sure have missed hearing them. Okay, on to leg 5. Hey, we did get to see where the racers stayed during the pit stop after leg 4, at the homes of locals. I thought that was pretty cool. What better way to experience Indonesia than that? Like staying at a bed and breakfast. In the home where Alyssa and Josiah stayed, she was so excited about the aroma of ground coffee in a container that she accidentally blew the grounds up into her face. Sorry, I thought that was pretty funny. Anyway, Jonathan and Anna were the first to leave the pit stop just a couple of minutes before 5 a.m. The clue told them to travel by taxi to a sacred monkey forest sanctuary. Carson and Jack left at 5:40 a.m., and Scott and Lori left just 1 minute later. In the taxis, each team shared their thoughts on their current situation. Jonathan expressed his realization that being in the driver's seat and deciding how much rice the other teams had to thresh put a target on their back. He was concerned that might hurt. Carson and Jack said they were surprised no one has yet put a target on their back due to their strong performances, but they were okay with being low-key. And Scott and Lori, they worried how they would make out at the U-turn, thinking their relationship with other teams would protect them. But when Jonathan and Anna arrived at the monkey sanctuary, they found it closed until 8 a.m. The other teams left the pit stop one by one, and Pops and Jeff left last at 6:05 a.m. The time gap between the first place team and the last place team was just over an hour, far less than the 4-hour gap on the previous leg. As they waited for the sanctuary to open, Jonathan and Anna, they tried to explain to Scott and Lori why they gave them 25 pounds of rice to collect at the roadblock, but Scott wasn't buying it. He took it personally, even though Jonathan and Anna didn't mean to be that way. Carson and Jack were there also, just watching the drama, again almost invisible. In the end, they hugged it out and waited for the other teams to arrive. All teams did arrive, and waited for the gates to open at 8 a.m. There were no numbers or tickets to mark their place in line, so they entered in a different order than the order they had arrived, which I thought was strange. Racers usually protect their place in line. They walked, did not run, through the sanctuary, looking for their next clue. Scott and Lori were in front. Phil was waiting for them, standing next to a bowl placed on the ground. Usually, it is not a good thing to see Phil while you're racing, and Lori was genuinely surprised to see him. Phil announced the live vote double U-turn. Now, on a classic U-turn detour, one team can tell another team to complete both tasks of the detour. Because of the time it takes to complete an additional task, U-turns are hard to overcome and can lead to elimination. It's not 100% guaranteed that the U-turn team will be eliminated, but getting U-turned is generally not good. On a double U-turn, as we have in this case, 2 teams get U-turned. And the live vote double U-turn means all teams publicly pick another to get U-turned. The 2 teams with the most votes both get U-turned. Since the vote is public, everyone can see how all other teams voted. That adds yet another twist. So now, let's talk about the strategy surrounding how to decide who to U-turn. There are a number of ways teams can decide how to view this choice, but I'd like to talk about an offense/defense view. First, a team could vote for the one team they think is the strongest, possibly forcing their elimination. This is using the U-turn offensively and seems the most logical. The pro of this is that by getting rid of the strongest team, the voting team would face less competition and have a better chance of winning. The voting team would take this opportunity to get rid of a strong team while they had the chance. The con of this is that if the U-turn team doesn't get eliminated, is able to somehow survive the U-turn, they just could battle their way back to the top and do what they could to eliminate the teams voting against them. So if a team uses the U-turn offensively, they need to be darn sure they eliminate the target or face some potential consequences. A second thought is to U-turn the weakest team. Because they are the weakest team, their elimination would almost certainly be guaranteed. Using this approach might apply to bottom-of-the-pack teams fighting not to be eliminated. This is using the U-turn defensively. They use the U-turn just to stay in the game and race another leg. Another reason why a team may vote to U-turn the perceived weakest team is to avoid upsetting the strongest teams by eliminating a team that probably will be eliminated anyway. It's similar to not voting at all, actually. A third way is not to U-turn at all. In classic U-turns from past seasons, teams have the choice not to U-turn anyone behind them. Why? We've seen over and over in past seasons when a team arrives first at a U-turn, but they say, "We decide not to U-turn anyone," and move on. Why wouldn't teams use a tool as powerful as the U-turn? Well, a team may decide not to U-turn another team because they don't want to upset other teams and have a target placed on their back by the team that got U-turned. But look, we can talk about this strategy and we can talk about that strategy, but in deciding how to vote, some teams may decide to U-turn another team because they just don't like them. Using emotion to make the decision, not logic. Perhaps holding a grudge from a past injustice. Scott called all of this gameplay. I call it the game beyond the game, or the metagame. Some teams are well aware of it, while other teams are oblivious to it. In summary, a team can U-turn to go on the offense, or U-turn to play defense, or decide not to play at all. But in this case, it seems all teams had to vote and could not abstain. Because 9 teams remained at this point, the max votes a team could get against them was 8. Because no team would vote to U-turn themselves. After voting was complete, Jonathan and Anna got 4 votes against them, and Scott and Lori also got 4 votes. Nick and Mike, they got 1 vote. So Jonathan and Anna and Scott and Lori had to perform both tasks of the detour. Next, let's look at who voted to U-turn Jonathan and Anna. Those teams were Pops and Jeff. They were upset that Jonathan and Anna gave them 25 pounds at the rice roadblock. Emotion played a part in their decision. Carson and Jack. They voted against their perceived strongest team and used their vote offensively. Alyssa and Josiah also voted offensively. And Scott and Lori, who seemed to vote based on emotion, I sensed they were still upset about the 25 pounds of rice at the rice roadblock and felt betrayed by who they thought were their friends. And how about those who voted to U-turn Scott and Lori? It was Brett and Mark. They selected them as their perceived strongest team and used their vote offensively. Han and Holden voted for them, using their vote offensively. And Melinda and Erica used their vote also offensively. And lastly, Nick and Mike voted offensively against Scott and Lori because they thought Jonathan and Anna would get the most votes, so they went against their second perceived strongest team. And for the lone vote to U-turn Nick and Mike, Jonathan and Anna used their vote defensively, wanting to eliminate their perceived weakest team and not wanting to upset other teams more than they already have. In summary, 8 teams voted offensively and only 1 voting defensively. And who didn't get any votes against them? Han and Holden, Pops and Jeff, Alyssa and Josiah, Melinda and Erica, Brett and Mark, and Carson and Jack. The final vote tally was concentrated on just 2 teams. I think it is interesting that Carson and Jack didn't get any votes. They are a strong team, but yet again, they seem to find ways to hide under the radar of the other teams. Personally, and I know there are many of you out there that would disagree with me on this, but I believe it is still too early in the race to vote offensively, even though 8 teams did. I believe, and I tell you this without any knowledge of what will happen in the future of the season, that there is still another U-turn detour coming up later in the season, around leg 9, plus or minus. This is based on patterns from past seasons. If so, then teams will have another opportunity to U-turn their perceived strongest teams. At this point, I believe teams should stay low-key until that final U-turn, then go on the offense hard. After that, there are little, if any, opportunities for teams to force out another team other than racing ability and luck. What are your thoughts? Would you use your U-turn vote against your perceived strongest team or against your perceived weakest team? Or vote against a team you just can't stand because they deserve to lose? Or perhaps some other reason I haven't mentioned? With the voting done, it's back to racing. Phil handed out a clue with route info to the next clue, which was at the beach. In the taxi on the way, Alyssa looked forward to getting to the top 3. Jeff said it was anyone's game, and Nick and Mike, they were relieved they were not U-turned. Everyone except Jonathan and Anna and Scott and Lori saw opportunity in their future. Those 2 teams saw potential doom, but Scott and Lori, they did keep an optimistic attitude. Lori said they were not going home that day. Jonathan told Anna to stop crying, in usual Jonathan fashion. At the detour, racers found out it was coconuts or coral. In coconuts, teams had to transport 60 coconuts on a bicycle down a paved path along the beach to a restaurant and arrange them in a specific way. It was physical, and it was in the hot sun, and it would take multiple trips. In coral, teams had to tie coral pieces to a wire rack in a specific way, and once approved, take the rack into the ocean and place it on the bottom. It required attention to detail and some swimming skills. Han and Holden arrived first, with Brett and Mark right on their heels. When Jonathan and Anna arrived, they selected coral and immediately failed to understand the assignment. It took 6 attempts to get their coral rack approved. Scott and Lori arrived last and picked coconuts to complete the hard task first. Other teams split between coral and coconuts. Alyssa and Josiah picked coconuts and decided to take 30 coconuts per trip and go slow and steady in 2 trips. Slow and steady again. We'll see if that pays off. Jack and Carson selected coral and recognized right away there was more to it than just randomly tying coral to the rack. There were different types and colors, and they had to go on in a certain way. They only needed 1 attempt to get it right, and moved off to the next clue in first place. The teams that selected coconuts had some difficulty removing the coconuts from the stems. It was a struggle to twist and break them off. All teams except Pops and Jeff. Because of their muscular build, they figured out if they could just give the bunch a good shake, coconuts would fall off the stems. After finally getting their coral approved, Jonathan and Anna headed to the water. But Anna had trouble in the water. She was not a strong swimmer and had a fear of water. This slowed them down again. Alyssa and Josiah finished the coconuts first and got their next clue. Both Jonathan and Anna and Scott and Lori finished their first task and moved on to their second task. Jonathan was exhausted and his shoulder hurt. And they hadn't even done the hard part yet. You could see Jonathan was beginning to struggle physically. Scott and Lori knew that the colors of the coral mattered. That's because Carson and Jack had told them earlier, but they still struggled to get it right. It took them 8 attempts. Meanwhile, Nick and Mike's pile of coconuts kept falling over, in typical Amazing Race fashion. Whenever racers stack items in a pyramid, it's always good for a laugh. Carson and Jack arrived at the roadblock first, which required a racer to ride on a surfboard out to a large group of other surfers in the ocean and match the decal exactly on their surfboard with one on a surfboard of the other surfers. Because the surfboard was so long, a racer couldn't use their feet to kick, so it was all arms to paddle around, a very tiring activity. In addition, it was also a needle in a haystack task, which means luck plays a role. Some racers will do it fast, like Erica, who found a match on her first try, while others struggled. Brett and Mark were right behind Carson and Jack, and then passed them and moved on to the pit stop. All teams then finished the coral or coconuts detour, all except for Jonathan and Anna and Scott and Lori. Jonathan was losing steam fast, and Scott was frustrated with the coral. In the end, Brett and Mark finished the leg first, winning $5,000 each. Carson and Jack came in second, and Alyssa and Josiah, they came in third. One thing I noted was that Erica decided to do the surfing roadblock instead of Melinda, and I wondered if that will affect them because in the future, Melinda will have to even out the imbalance and do some tasks when they're usually harder. That left a battle for last place, and the elimination loomed for either Jonathan and Anna or Scott and Lori. Then, Jonathan and Anna left for the roadblock, with Scott and Lori working to catch up to the physically and mentally exhausted Jonathan. It was a battle, taking everything each had, making them dig deep inside to keep racing. But it was Jonathan and Anna who came in 8th, barely avoiding elimination. Scott and Lori finished last, in 9th place on the leg, and were eliminated. Their undoing was that they had arrived last at the double detour, took a long time to complete the coral task, then arrived last at the surfing roadblock, and just couldn't pass Jonathan and Anna. In episode 1 of my podcast, I had predicted Scott and Lori would win it all. Oh boy, was I wrong, as is the usual outcome when I predict the $1 million winners during the first leg. So, How did the U-turn affect the outcome of this leg? Those 4 teams who voted to U-turn Scott and Lori, which were Brett and Mark, Nick and Mike, Han and Holden, and Melinda and Erica, got what they wanted, the elimination of Scott and Lori. But the 4 teams that voted to U-turn Jonathan and Anna, which were Alyssa and Josiah, Carson and Jack, Pops and Jeff, and Scott and Lori, were not successful in eliminating them, but it did push them to last place. Will Jonathan and Anna hold a grudge against the 3 remaining teams in the future? I'll keep track of that. But Nick and Mike vowed revenge on Jonathan and Anna for voting to U-turn them. Jonathan and Anna voted against the brothers because they thought them as a non-threat. But Nick and Mike didn't see themselves as a non-threat, just the opposite. In fact, they see themselves as contenders. So we will see how that plays out too. Jonathan and Anna may have dropped to last place, and for whatever reason, he ran out of gas on this leg despite seemingly being in good shape. But they are a strong team. Will they be able to move up to the top 3 again? In my previous podcast episode, I had talked about how it appeared that Jonathan and Anna had squandered their express pass for little gain. I bet they wish they had it on this episode. This was a dramatic and exhausting episode, more difficult than most to keep track of where the racers were in relationship to one another. But I really enjoyed the live vote double U-turn detour. It was, in my opinion, the most influential event so far this season, forcing all teams to play the game beyond the game with some potentially serious consequences. And as such, I look forward even more than usual to the next episode to see how the decisions made at the U-turn influence the rest of the race. It's why I watch every week, why I watched every leg of every past season, why I make this podcast. Well, it's time to wrap up this episode. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening. I'm glad that you did. And join me next time for episode number 6 of Jason's Amazing Race Recap 37, and we'll find out together what happens to our racers. See you then.